The way that we work has changed pretty fundamentally in 2020. Many organizations, including Microsoft, are now working remotely for at least large parts of their workforce. As defenders, we need to adapt and protect our organizations and our workers wherever they are and whatever technology they're using. My name's Pete, and I work for the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. And what I'm going to be talking to you today is about how you can protect the remote workloads that your workforce rely on in this new working situation, and how we can use Azure Sentinel to enable that protection. So in this new working environment, the security picture and what is normal for security has also changed. We're seeing an increase of attackers focusing on remote workloads, using remote workload and remote working based lures for things like phishing. And we're also seeing regulators, consumers, and government organizations focusing more on protecting and assuring those remote workloads than ever before. That means defensive teams need to think about not only how to enable that remote working, but enable it securely. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Azure Sentinel, it's Microsoft's cloud-based SIEM solution that brings together the cloud scale of data storage and data processing with advanced analytics, machine learning-based detection and hunting capabilities, and an automation capability to allow you to automate your response to security incidents. And today, we're going to look at using three main remote workloads with Sentinel. They are going to be Microsoft's Teams, which is the core of many organizations' remote working, Zoom, which is a remote collaboration and video conferencing tool that has seen a massive increase in popularity under the lockdown of 2020. And we're also going to look at GitHub. You might not immediately think of GitHub as a remote working tool, but it's the place where you're going to collaborate, share, and store your most sensitive data. So it's important to consider these workloads in the overall consideration of remote working. So to bring the data from these separate solutions into Azure Sentinel, we're going to use a number of different connection types. The first is the native connector between Microsoft Teams and Azure Sentinel. This has just been released in public preview in September 2020 and allows you to bring audit and management data from Teams straight into Sentinel with a single click. However, we're also going to want to use the core records that Teams has. These are the records about online meetings, who was in them, what sort of meetings they were. To collect those, we need to use an Azure Logic app to query the core records API and write the data into Azure Sentinel. In the same way, we need to collect data from Zoom and their remote API. To do that, we're going to use an Azure function to query that API and bring the data in. And finally, for GitHub and GitHub Enterprise, we're going to use another Logic app to bring that data from their API into Sentinel. Details on how to enable these methods and the technology behind them can be found in our tech community blogs, where we go into step-by-step details of enabling all of this. Once we've collected our data into Azure Sentinel, we need to go about understanding it. It's important that we do this before that we start investigations or threat hunting. Unless we understand what data we have and how it relates to each other, there's not a lot we can easily do with it. Here, I have a simple diagram that shows the interrelationship between just one key entity in each data source. Here, we're looking at the account entity, and we can see that it appears in the user ID field of the Teams logs, and it appears in the user ID or participant field in Zoom logs. In addition, that same field appears in the actor field of GitHub logs. By mapping this out in advance, it will make our lives much easier when we want to pivot and hunt through the data later on. So now that we understand the data a bit, we're going to look at conducting a threat hunt. In this scenario, we have a user who has reported a suspicious user account being in one of their Zoom meetings that day. This is quite a common scenario that security teams face, as user reporting is often the first time that a suspicious incident involving a workload like Zoom can appear. So now I'm going to jump into Azure Sentinel, and we're going to walk through that investigation the hunt, and some of our next steps together. So the first thing I'm going to do to start my investigation is navigate to the Azure portal and go to Azure Sentinel. Now, the most useful tool for threat hunting within Azure Sentinel is the log querying capability. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to my log view and write a query. What this query does is look at my Zoom logs and looks for meetings that occurred on the day in question, and where the user who organized the meeting was the user who reported the suspicious user. Then I'm going to take those meetings and look for anywhere where a user joined one of those meetings and simply list them out. So running this query, it gives me a list of every user who was in that meeting. I can see I have quite a number. And what I now want to do is try and identify the anomalous ones. To help do that, what I'm going to do is join that query and look for any user who was in that meeting who was not seen in a Zoom meeting prior to this one and is not part of any of my team's environments. So running that query, I can instantly see that actually I'm down to a single user. That user appears to come from a Contoso partner domain, but with a 0 instead of one of the O's. This is something we have seen attackers doing, registering very similar, particularly on Microsoft domains, in an attempt to typo squat or appear legitimate and appear as another domain. So now that I have found this suspicious user, I want to start pivoting around and seeing what else they did. One of the things that Zoom includes in their logs is the ability to look at any chat messages or typed instant messages sent during a meeting. Here I'm going to take the query we had before, but this time what I'm going to do is focus on any chat messages that were sent by the participants in that meeting. We obviously can't see what was or hear what was said in the meeting, but the chat messages give us an idea of what might have happened. So here I can see that that user we saw before, Tim Vick, sent a message saying, "Gary, can you add me to that Teams group you just mentioned? I don't have access." What appears to have happened here is our malicious user has tried to social engineer his way into a Teams group that was talked about on the Zoom call. So now that I have that, I know that there's another place for me to go pivot and look at. So what I'm going to do here is, instead of looking at Zoom, I'm going to look at my Teams activity under the Office activity table. And what I'm going to do is look for anyone who was added by a user called Gary. In this case, if we looked at the original list of everyone who was in that meeting, there was only one Gary, that's Gary Hawley, so we can focus on there. What I'm also going to do is remove any rows from my data where the user Gary added was part of my contoso.com domain. I know I'm looking for external domains, so I can limit it. Running this, I can see, yep, Gary did add our Tim Vick user, and they added them to a particular team related to a project. So again, I've now quickly and simply built up a little bit more of what's happening here. And if we think about that graph we created earlier with the relationship between different entities and log types, that knowledge allowed us to easily pivot on the user ID field, knowing it was common across Teams and across Zoom. Now, what I want to do is look for any activity that Tim Vick user might have conducted within Teams. I can do that very simply just by searching for anything related to that user ID. And here I can see they've added 2 users. So the first is Guy Badson, and the second is Bad Guyson. Again, quite common for attackers once they have access to an environment to create new accounts to continue to access and move around that environment, separating out that first stage of access with follow-on stages. Now, I could continue to run queries to understand what those two new users have done. However, understanding links between text rows can be quite difficult. I want something a bit more visual. For that, I'm going to go into the Azure Sentinel workbooks. These are great capabilities that allow you to easily visualize data for dashboards or other purposes. Here I've used the graph visualization to create a relationship graph between all those different elements I just looked at. Here, if we zoom in, we can see we have our user, Tim Vick. We can see he was added by our user, Gary, and that he subsequently added Bad Geisen, and down here, Guy Badson. We can also see with these green dots all of the teams that those users are part of. So obviously, once they had that initial access, those other user accounts have pivoted around, and through social engineering or requesting access, they have managed to get their way into multiple other teams. This is really useful for instant response and knowing the blast radius of an attacker once they have access to your environment. And again, without the visualization of workbooks, understanding these links would be a lot more difficult. Now that we've been through these queries and looked at what's going on, the other thing we want to do is look at what meetings they're in. Remember, the Teams logs under the Office activity relate to key kind of admin and management activity. We need to go to our customized call logs that we're bringing in via a Logic app to look at those. So here, what I want to do is look for call logs on the day in question, or on a few dates either side, and where any of the participants were one of my attackers. Now again, if we go back to that work we did to understand the logs before we started our investigation, we know that the call logs don't use UPN and instead have a display name. So here we've taken the display name for each of those users and we're going to see if they appear. Running that, we can see there are a number of group calls where those users were part of it. We can see who organized them and what features were used in those calls. Were they audio, were they video, was screen share used, etc. Again, this is all valuable information for our instant response team to go further look into this and do something about it. But all of these queries are running retrospectively. What we also need to do is keep up with what is currently going on. These malicious accounts are still in our environment and they could still be accessing Teams, they could still be joining meetings. To help us keep track of this, we're going to use the Livestream feature in the hunting capabilities of Azure Sentinel. What Livestream allows us to do is to run a query against all incoming data and raise that to us as it occurs. So here we have the similar query we were looking at before, but what we just want to do is see any time one of our attackers, one of those malicious accounts, joins a meeting. We can then keep track of that in real time and pass that off to our instant response teams to go deal with it. So I've created my Livestream query. I can simply hit play. I can see it's running. And whenever a result happens to appear in my logs, it will appear in that table below. Whilst we're waiting for those logs to appear, we can go and put some more proactive controls in place to stop this happening in future. The first thing we want to do is create an analytic rule to look for new or suspicious domains being added to our team. To do this, I've created an analytic which is available via our Azure Sentinel GitHub. And what this does is looks for any new external domains being added. So this is where a user is added and they come from a domain that we have not seen any activity from before. I've created this query and I can see with the results preview that it's not going to give me a large number of results. But at the same time, this could be quite noisy. And there could be a number of external domains who are added where it's completely benign. rather than have a SOC team investigate that each time, we're going to want to automate some of that capability. So to do that, what we can do is tie our rule or our analytic to a playbook. What the playbook does is automates a workflow. Here is my playbook that I've created. What it's doing is looking for alerts or analytics that are fired related to that suspicious external Teams user. And what it's going to do is, first of all, automatically post a message to Teams to let people know that this user has been added and it is anomalous. Again, putting the responsibility back to the end user a bit. Secondly, we're going to send an approval email to a specified user. What this approval email does is provide details of the alert and a yes or no approve or deny button. If they approve it, what we do is we close the incident in Azure Sentinel to reduce the workload of our SOC analysts. If they deny it, what we can go do is raise that level of that incident or that alert up to critical, so it becomes a priority for us to work on. By using this automated response capability, we can significantly improve the workflow of our analysts by doing some basic work to prepare the ground and give them some context, rather than just having the pure technical indicators. Now that we've looked at those analytics, we can go back to our live stream and see if we've had any activity. Here we can see we still have no new results. But if we wait a little while longer, we can see that actually we've just had an event pop in. And we can see one of those malicious users, Guy Badson, has joined yet another group call. We can then pass this off in real time to our incident response teams to go include that in their analysis and their investigation. What we can also do to be more proactive is to include a hunting query. Now, when an incident happens, quite often you're going to want to look for any future activity related to indicators from that incident. So here I've created a query related to the incident that looks for any activity from any of those accounts that we previously saw, as well as other indicators created and found during our incident response process. Rather than having to manually run that query each time, I've saved it as a hunting query, and I can simply click Run All Queries to see the latest results. And if there are any, I can then dig in from there using the investigation graph or the log view to get further detail. This is a very simple and truncated incident investigation and threat hunt based off an initial user report and looking in all of our Teams, Zoom, and GitHub data in order to fully understand and scope our incident here. So in that demo, we saw how to investigate effectively across our remote workloads and the data they have in Azure Sentinel. We also looked at how to automate out some of the response to that to allow us to scale properly. And we also looked at how to use some of the advanced features, particularly around hunting, to make future investigation and detection easier. However, it's still worth remembering that protection is your best and primary control. Microsoft Teams and the other remote workloads we talked about have a host of features to protect you in the first place and prevent incidents, and they should always be your first port of call. So what can you go do about this right now? So as I said, protection is your best and primary control. So the first thing you should go and do is check your security settings for all of those remote workloads. Also, look at onboarding data from those workloads now. Don't wait to bring that data into Sentinel until after you've had an incident, because at that stage, it's too late. Also, spend the time now to understand your data. Build baselines, set up hunting queries and analytics, and conduct threat hunts to find anomalous or suspicious activity. Doing that now, rather than after an incident, will make you more secure and speed up any incident response you might have to do in the future. Thanks for watching this session. I hope you found it useful. If you're interested in Azure Sentinel and want to learn more, we have a number of other sessions available for you. They're displayed on the screen now, and you can go check them out to get further insight and learning into what Azure Sentinel can do for you.